How you guys doing today? Good? Good? Thumbs up all around? Anybody not? Okay? I'm actually really looking forward to not spring break. What is it? Spring holiday? Yeah, spring holiday. So, today we're doing another day, our last day, our second/last day of coverage of Rousseau's The Social Contract. In our last meeting, we actually got all of the major conceptual furniture into the room. Today we're just going to kind of be elaborating on this. And maybe I can revisit a question that I addressed at the beginning of our last session, which is this question of is Rousseau a good writer? Is he making his ideas clear in the social contract? And he even kind of gives a little bit of a nod to some potential problems with this at some point in book 2. We're gonna let me finish the thought. He says that my ideas all hang together, but I can't get them all out at once. And this is maybe when I don't know about you guys, when I read that phrase, I'm just kind of boy, that's a mouthful right there, Rousseau, because it seems like every single thing he says there's almost a Kantian flair to this, although he's pre-Kant, so maybe Kant has a Rousseauian flair to him. Where we might say something like he's really just kind of expressing the same idea over and over and over again from slightly different directions. And the big idea, we're going to kind of talk about this in a variety of ways. We're going to talk about the general will some more today. We're going to talk about sovereignty in some slightly new and different ways. We're going to talk about the law and the lawgiver. Maybe the lawgiver is something that's not part of the same thing. But the law, the people, the sovereign and sovereignty, and the general will, if the way that you kind of help yourself out with trying to keep hold of all this is to think to yourself this is all the same thing for Rousseau, you could be doing a whole lot worse. These are all just different profiles of roughly the same thing. He's trying to articulate this idea of what it is that a civil state looks like. And perhaps, like Rousseau's writing, it's this thing that it all hangs together, but it's difficult to say it all at once. We're going to start off with kind of rehashing some stuff in book 1 just because it's so important that we can't kind of get away with not rehearsing it. We only talked about it once at our last meeting, and it's complicated enough that it bears a little bit of review. Then we'll get into some of the stuff that's going on in book 2, which is, as I was just saying, really not a whole lot more than an elaboration of what's going on in book 1 in some slightly more specific terms. Oh, all right. Let's make sure I got everybody who's here actually here, and good, attendance is done. The general will. Let's start here. Test your mental acuity and your memory and your comprehension of Rousseau. What is the general will? And again, not a rhetorical question. That's a real question. You guys tell me. What's the general will? We talked about this at our last meeting. Pearson. The body politic. Yeah, we could do a whole lot worse than kind of glomming onto this. It's a bit of a metaphor, but maybe not. Rousseau refers to this as the body politic. Oh, that's not good. You guys like me, and 99% of the calls that you get are just not people that you know? I'm on the do not call list. I don't know how the number got out there, but bad people have it. Okay, the body politic. I'll go ahead and put it in quotes so we can think about it in a metaphorical sense. This body politic is a body, right? Did we talk about bodies and body parts at all last time? I know we talked about ensemble musicianship and we talked about team sports. Did we talk about bodies and body parts? So bodies have parts, right? Maybe we can go all the way back to Descartes with this, where he was this is what it means to be an extended body, is that it's divisible into parts, right? This is part of the argument that he makes about how the body is distinct from the soul, because the soul doesn't have parts. Well, maybe the soul does have something kind of like parts. It has faculties or something like this. But yeah, the soul is not divisible the same way that a body is, but without getting into too much kind of adult content, what's up with body parts? Are body parts separable from the body? Like, I can cut my hand off, and then like, my hand is like just a part of my body, but it's been separated. But is my hand, when I cut it off, is it like part of my body anymore? Wouldn't be too good on its own, right? Yeah. Do any of my body parts sometimes like rebel and are just like, let's say I'm in the cold and it's really cold, and my body starts drawing blood away from the extremities so that I don't die of hypothermia. And then like my toes are just like, whoa, body, you can't do that. If you like draw blood away from us, we're going to get frostbite and die. And like, can the toes be angry? Maybe we're doing a little bit of anthropomorphization here, but like, would it make sense for the toes to be angry that they're not being well tended to by the body here?
Not necessarily. The entire body's trying to save itself.
The body's trying to save itself, yeah. What happens if the body doesn't save itself? The toes are still going to die anyway, right? So this is like, if the toes are going to have a chance, the body needs to survive, right? We can think about this as like a very powerful metaphor here. This body politic is this thing where we would say like all of these various parts of the body are such that they only succeed if the whole body succeeds. We might also, we'll get into this in just a second, about like what we might do with rebellious body parts. Is there such a thing as like parts of your body that are just kind of like, screw you, rest of the body, I'm going for myself? This is like cancer, right? And at that point, maybe we might think to ourselves, like, is the body entitled to just try to kill the cancer and get rid of it? Yeah, maybe, right? All right, so think about this idea of a body politic. Rousseau also talks about this in terms of a republic, and both he and our translators stress the literal Latin parts of republic. It's a res publica, right? Like res extensa, res cogitans, the thinking substance. The extended thing, or the extended substance, that's res cogitans and res extensa. Res publica is like the public thing. It is some public thing. That's what the general will is. It's some public thing. The way that Rousseau defines this is he says, the general will is this public person that's formed by the union. I'll come back to that idea of a union. It's formed by the union of all of the other persons. And is this what a body is? A body is like, it's just the union of all the body parts? It is, but maybe we want to say this in a stronger sense than just a mere conglomeration, right? If I took a whole bunch of dismembered body parts and I put them in a pile, and I was like, that's a body, somebody might say, like, that's a pile of parts. But I don't know if I would say that it's a body just yet. They have to be organized in a certain way. And they have to be coordinated. We talked at our last meeting about the individual will needing to be alienated in its totality for the sake of the general will. We'll use that word, alienation. Suggested some other terms that might be helpful and might get closer to getting us to like what it is that Rousseau is trying to talk about. It's of the individual will with the general will. This is what's required in order for us to move into civil society. In order for there to even be a general will, there needs to be an identification of all of the individual wills with that general will. If we don't have that, the general will just kind of evaporates. It falls apart. There is no body if all of the parts aren't somehow, the parts don't really identify themselves, I suppose, in the same way that toes don't have particular desires. But if they're not all recognizing that their own success is the same thing as the success of the whole, then everything falls apart. There is no whole functioning body anymore, and then it's just a matter of time before there are no parts either. They're going to decay and fall apart as well. Another kind of powerful term that we might think about here is coordination. Because whereas like Rousseau is saying here literally that it's the union of all of the individuals, that it's a union of all of the individual persons into like one public person. We saw that idea with Hobbes, right? This was that picture on the frontispiece of the Leviathan. It's the Leviathan is made up of the union of all of the individuals. But that just kind of gets us at this idea of like how the power comes together, right? If we're going to say that the general will is this union of all the individual wills, maybe we think of it as like, well, it's bigger. You take all the individual wills and you put them together, and now you have a big will, perhaps a more powerful will. What we get with this idea of identification or coordination is like, in addition to kind of an increased power that's kind of provided by the sovereign or the general will or the civil state, we're getting a kind of not just a combination of the wills into one bigger, more powerful will, but we're getting a coordination of them so that they're all pointed in the same direction as well, right? So it's not just this brute union. It is a union in the sense of coordination into a whole, of identification of all the parts with the whole. Some other really fun stuff that Rousseau says about the general will and kind of explaining it in various terms. We can get this metaphor of the body politic, of the res publica, right? Rousseau talks about it as, he says, you can think of the general will as the state if you're thinking about it in a passive sense. And you can think of it as the sovereign when you're thinking about it in the active sense. So when the general will is kind of maybe not in kind of like an actual activity right now, we can talk about it as the state, and this captures one dimension of the general will. If we want to think about it as active and doing things, perhaps commanding all of the parts, we can think of it as the sovereign. But they are two sides of the same coin. There's like an active and a passive capacity to the general will. We can also think about this in terms of the people. And we can think of the people in a similar sort of an active and a passive sense. So the people, when we're thinking about them in their passive sense, such that we would associate them with the whole of the state, what would I call that? Maybe it will help. Shall we do the other one first? What do I call individual people in a civil society who have come together as a people, as a whole? But we're thinking about them in terms of their parts now, them as parts, but as active parts in the civil society, as kind of acting with sovereignty. Citizens. There we go. Yeah, good. Excellent. That was a reach. I was not sure. I was like, are they going to get this one? But yeah, good. All right. They're citizens in this kind of active sense, that the citizens are acting with sovereignty. And what's this other side? Subjects. Yeah, good. Was that a quiz question, or are you guys just like really on top of this? It was a quiz question? All right. And it doesn't have to be an either or. Yeah, and you're on top of this. So yeah. Citizens in the sense that like we command, right? In that like we make the rules and we like exert this authority in this active sense of like each of our participations in the general will, in the sovereign, in the state, in the law, as the people, right? And subjects in the sense that like we receive the commands, that we are commanded. And this is why Rousseau is able to say things like the social contract is something, so the social contract that kind of like brings this general will together. The social contract is a contract that each of us makes with ourselves. This is a different formulation than we've seen from folks like Locke and Hobbes, where the social contract is something that each individual makes with all of the other individuals that come together and form the state. Now we're thinking about this as something that each individual does with themselves, such that like we become citizen and subject to ourselves. Now all this talk of like parts and wholes seems like it might sort of suggest a possible objection. Let me kind of like block this off just for a second. Might avail itself of a possible objection, one that Rousseau acknowledges in, I think it's Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Social Contract. And if you guys follow contemporary, kind of 20th century politics, you might have recognized this objection too. It's one that's really, really similar to an objection that Ayn Rand makes. It's an objection that suggests that we're just making an ontological mistake when we talk about members of a society as parts of a whole. Such that we would say something like, look, man, I'm not just some part of a whole. We might even say that whole is a fiction. Individuals come first. Societies are these things that like we invent this concept of a society, of a whole that like we're all kind of like parts of. But first and foremost, and perhaps in reality, each of us is an individual. Here's what Rousseau has to say about this. He's imagining this objection, and he says, suppose somebody says the following. Suppose they say this: I have an absolute and naturally independent existence. I am not something that exists only because certain items have come together in an association. So what I am said to, quote unquote, owe to the common cause, i.e. to the body politic or the sovereign, whose existence is in that way dependent on the conduct of its members. Pause for just a moment. The society, the whole, the people, is dependent on me. I am not dependent on the people. And perhaps there's some truth to this. But I don't know if it's only just one side of the coin like that. And this is really a gift. What the whole of society owes to me that I give it is a gift, a handout. And if I withhold it, that won't harm anyone else as much as it will benefit me. As for the moral person that constitutes the state, that is not a man, but a mere mental construct. Rand says almost exactly the same thing in kind of critiquing this idea of kind of a communitarian identification of the whole with the parts. Or, perhaps worse, putting the whole before the parts, if you've heard this, that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? But we can imagine somebody who would make an objection that says something like, no. First and foremost, and of paramount moral value, is my existence as an individual. And insofar as the society has any value at all, it's this conglomeration of the values of all of the individuals that kind of get lumped together and compose it. This is a powerful, I don't know, how good of an objection is this? Pearson, you look like you smelled a fart.
I feel like it's more reciprocal. Like it's kind of like the state really does improve your life a lot.
Yeah.
But you also are what keeps the state like in its existence. So like I think it's kind of both.
In the same way that like we can think about like body parts and body whole?
Yes.
Yeah, that like, what's that? Needlessly prideful. Maybe needlessly kind of like confident in this idea that like, look, I can do just fine on my own. I don't need the society as much as the society needs me. And it's like, ooh, I don't know. Like, be careful about that. Might even think about this as kind of like even the forms of societies that we form in the state of nature, right? Like families. Because humans, have we talked about this before, about how just unbelievably awful newborn humans are at surviving? So like when I say like, can you make it on your own? A lot of people think like, all right, so I'll go to like the sporting goods store, I'll get a whole bunch of survival gear, and then I'll go off into the woods and become a hermit on my own. And we're like, well, no, you can't do that, because now you're benefiting from like the help and cooperation of others who like made all this bitchin' survival gear for you. So you got to be able to do it like super low tech. And you're like, I've seen YouTube channels of people that go off into like the woods with nothing at all, and they find a sharp rock and they start like building things up from that. Primitive technology. You guys familiar with this YouTube channel? It is like so soothing to watch this guy just like make his own mud hut. Yeah. Josh?
But that's using the knowledge.
That's perhaps, using the knowledge. And on top of that, he went off on his own as a fully functioning adult. If you imagined him like abandoned in the woods as an infant, like no. Perhaps more so, and this is maybe one way we can think of a sort of like natural fitness for society that like, or a natural need for society that all of us have, is that like a lot of animals are ready to go almost right away. A gazelle on the prairie, it's born, it's wobbly for a couple of minutes, and then it's running. Humans, absolutely useless pooping and crying machines for at least 3 years? 20 years? We can't make it on our own. We just can't. We can't, right? Well, maybe we could as like individuals, but then we're kind of like tossed back into like, you'd have to be all by yourself. What if you came across other people who are on their own? And then we have like Hobbesian state of nature problems that are kind of springing up. So there's something about this objection that is kind of maybe a little bit intuitively appealing, but on kind of further inspection, maybe it's not as compelling as it might seem. At the very least, we might say like, this is tricky. I'm not really sure what to make of this. I'm not really sure what to say about like the priority of the parts or the priority of the whole. We might say that neither has priority, that they kind of co-constitute one another. This is, by the way, if we're kind of thinking about like that objection sounds like stupid. That objection sounds like a sort of an arrogance. We'll note what Rousseau's response to this objection is. Almost immediately he responds with the following. It means nothing less than each individual will be forced to be free. This is immediately on the tails of this objection that Rousseau gives us this forced to be free idea. And we got to this in our last meeting, right? That Rousseau says, those who talk like this, those who act like this, those who would put their own individual interests ahead of the interests of the whole, those who would put their own will ahead of the general will, perhaps even those who would make a distinction between the individual will and the general will, these people are going to need to be forced to be free. And my question with this at our last meeting was, what the hell does that mean? Like, how can you force someone to be free? Can you force somebody? If you force them to be free, they're not really free, are they? Jack.
When he says that, does he mean literally make them free and throw them in the backwoods and just see how they do?
So this is one way that we could talk about forcing people to be free. We could kick them out. Although it's interesting that like Rousseau doesn't say a whole lot about banishing people in this conversation of forcing them to be free, or even later. When we get into conversations of the sovereign and the things that it can do, what sorts of limits on its power there might be, he talks about the death penalty. Is this forcing somebody to be free? There, I've freed you from this mortal coil. I've killed you. Think again of the cancer, right? Cancer wants to be on its own. All right, cancer, I'll kill you. Forced you to be free? Plato talks like this sometimes, that in dying you become more free, but I don't know if I'm buying that. Can you make somebody free by killing them? It certainly seems to fly in the face of any kind of intuitive moral objections I might have to murder, that it's not somehow doing somebody a favor. Charles.
Something like banishment has sort of like a physical location implication, like I'm going to physically remove you from society.
Mm-hmm.
My idea was that you meant exclude them from the social contract.
Exclude them from the social contract. They have, in fact, already excluded themselves from the social contract, in fact, right? We can regard them as like they're not actually part of the whole anymore if they've decided to cut themselves off from it. So we can help them do whatever it is that they want. But again, this would be, what would this look like? Would it be banishment? Would the death penalty fit? Would putting somebody in prison fit? Does that force somebody to be free? Continue, Charles.
I feel like it means like if there was a guy who's like, oh, I could be fine on my own as an individual because I'm so great, so I'm going to go live in the woods. And we're like, all right, you go do that. And then he goes to stop by the sporting goods store first on his way out. It means the people at the sporting goods store should be like, no.
Yeah, no, you don't get.
Great. No, you should need our stuff.
You don't get any help. Yeah.
Trade with them.
If you really want to be free, then like go ahead and be free.
You can physically be within the society, within the nation, or whatever, but just everybody excluded. It seems like this kind of like, if you don't want to be a part of the club, then I guess you're not part of the club. You don't get the benefits as well. If you're going to complain about the drawbacks, you don't get all of the prizes that come along with those drawbacks. But again, this does not seem to be the sort of thing that Rousseau is talking about. He doesn't really talk about banishment all that time. He doesn't talk about social isolation. It's not like a timeout that he's talking about. He's talking about like exerting the full force of sovereignty of the general will on this person to make them comply, to bring them to heel. This is getting awfully close to the sort of stuff that Hobbes says about like this is the whole purpose of sovereignty, is it's to get people into compliance, to force them to be free. part of the way that we might be able to make some sense of this, because this is genuinely a kind of like a puzzling sentiment from Rousseau, given everything else that he said, because it almost seems, not just almost, it totally seems like the whole trick to making this thing work for Rousseau is this idea that like everybody participates willingly in society, right? Nobody is made to do anything against their will. This is why he says at the very, very beginning of the social contract, man is born free, yet everywhere in chains, right? The whole business with us being in chains is that like we have to follow rules that we don't want to follow. And insofar as we feel somewhat oppressed by these rules, insofar as these rules seem to thwart our will or work against our interests, then we're in fact not free. We're enslaved. And this is the sort of thing that seems to be going on here. As soon as you have somebody, like it's all well and good to suggest that like we start off with a people that all identify that like, hey, we're all in this together, and then we make rules, and everybody likes the rules because everybody like agrees on the rules, and everybody agrees that the rules are necessary, and everybody knows that the health of the body politic is necessary for the health of all of the parts, and that like the way that I look out for myself when I say that I make this social contract with myself is that it's a deal that I make with myself. It's for my own benefit, and everything that like the sovereign does, everything that civil society subjects me to, everything that I have to endure as a subject of the body politic is something that I suffer with a smile. Except as soon as somebody says, but I don't wanna. So what do we do with those people? And can we do it in such a way that respects their liberty, that kind of honors this thing that Rousseau says at the very beginning of the social contract when he says, like, look, I'm trying to figure out if there's such a thing as a legitimate civil state, and in order for it to be legitimate, there has to be no loss of liberty. So can there be no loss of liberty if you're forcing somebody to be free? The way that Rousseau seems to be able to try to make some sense of this, and I think he's reasonably successful, is he makes this distinction. We got to this at our last meeting too, right? Distinction between natural liberty and civil liberty. But we rushed it maybe? All right. Natural liberty versus civil liberty. We'll force them to give up their natural liberty because after all, this was what the person who was making the objection was saying, right? I have an absolute and naturally independent existence. Sure, in the state of nature, each of us is independent and separate individuals. But in civil society, perhaps not. Interdependent on one another, the same way that body parts are interdependent on one another to make a whole. So there's natural liberty, and we force them to give that up so that they'll adopt this civil liberty instead, and in which case they still get to remain free. In fact, maybe it's even a better freedom. What's this difference between natural liberty and civil? Like, it's one thing to say that, like, oh, there's a natural liberty and there's a civil liberty, and that one's not as good and this one's better. Oh, okay, sure, Rousseau. Like, wait, what's he talking about? Is this believable? Again, not a rhetorical question. What's the difference between natural liberty and civil liberty? Jack? Yeah, insofar as like your will is free, I don't know if that makes any sense. Insofar as like you have a will, then you can exercise that will. This is kind of like what John Locke talks about in the essay, right? You have a will, you can exercise it. Sometimes you get what you want, and in those moments you're free. Sometimes you don't get what you want. In those moments you're constrained, and you're not free. You're not at liberty to do whatever you want. This is natural liberty? Yeah, maybe. He gives us some examples to think about this. What's the example of natural liberty that he offers up? Possession, yeah. Mere possession. And we saw this with Hobbes, we saw it with Locke as well. That it's one thing to say that like I can get things in my possession, but my possession only guarantees me access to this thing that I possess insofar as I have the power to hold on to it. If somebody else overpowers me and takes it away from me, I lose that possession. But there's something that I don't lose even when somebody takes something out of my possession, and that's this kind of analog of possession that I get in the civil state. That's property, yeah. And in the better than mere possession. Civil liberty is better than natural liberty. And in case you need the deal to be sweetened just a little bit more, Rousseau tacks on yet another liberty, and this is moral liberty. And this is actually quite a big deal. It's quite a big deal because it helps us make sense of exactly how it is that like Rousseau isn't doing some kind of sleight of hand move where he's just kind of like I took away your natural liberty, but I gave you civil liberty, so you came out better for it. When we add in this moral liberty, we get a much clearer sense of what it is that Rousseau says we're getting by coming together and identifying as a people, by coming together and identifying as one body politic, by subsuming our individual wills under the general will. What is moral liberty? Yes, Jamarian. Yeah, moral liberty is the ability to be my own boss, the ability to rule myself. And we might say to ourselves, wait, hold on, didn't I have this over here in natural liberty? And Rousseau's like, no, you don't. Kant is going to double down on this in our next reading, in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. He's going to be like, you are not talking about any kind of interesting liberty when we're talking about natural liberty. It's this ability to rule myself. And what do we mean by the ability to rule myself? This requires restraint. It's not just doing whatever you feel like. My dog can do whatever she feels like. She does not have liberty. She has a kind of natural freedom, but it's not really liberty. My dog is not her own master. Kind of. I don't know if that's true, because I work with most of what I work with on with my dog is self-restraint. Put a treat down on the table. She's going to go after it. I'm like, wait. And she's like, She even adopts certain strategies. She'll look away. She's like, don't let the treat be in my field of view, because if I look at it, I know I won't be able. Do you do this with yourself as well? That if there's something you're like, I want that, but I oughtn't have it, so I have to exercise my will, right? I have to maybe even put up blocks and barriers to myself. Like, look away. Don't even look at it. And this is being your own ruler. This is being your own boss. Because you're just a slave to your passions otherwise. There's not a morally interesting sort of liberty at work with just mere natural liberty. Something a little more interesting with civil liberty. This is a kind of liberty that I have good reason to expect others will respect. And with moral liberty, Rousseau manages to close this circle where it's not just about I have a liberty that others have to respect. It's I have a liberty that I respect. I respect my own rule by being able to rule myself, which means being able to restrain myself. Not just do whatever I feel like. Recognize what I should do and have that be something that governs what I want to do. Does this make sense? Yes.
No, you have moral liberty in natural liberty and in civil.
No, you only, Rousseau, good question. Rousseau says you only get moral liberty in a civil state. You only get moral liberty in a civil state because you can't become the sort of thing that has moral liberty until you're in the civil state. There's no way for you to learn moral liberty outside of the civil state. And again, think back to small children. Can they rule themselves? Can they restrain themselves? Or do small children just do whatever they feel like? MK, I'm sorry, were you...
If you've read it, I feel like
I have read Lord of the Flies, yeah.
that they could try, but I noticed that it's literally fire.
In a state of nature, in fact, yeah. There's actually few better literary examples of a Hobbesian state of nature than Lord of the Flies. And this, perhaps, is this? Anybody spend a lot of time caring for, trying to govern small children? And you recognize they do not do a good job of governing themselves. Just last night I was talking about like an experience that I had when I was like a teenager with like a 5-year-old who just like turned and looked at another 5-year-old. I was watching them and like I saw like something went through their head and I'm like, what are they thinking? Are they going to hug the kid next to them? Are they going to like talk to you? They just punched him right in the face. And I like pulled him aside and I was like, why did you do that? And the kid just looked at me like it was a nonsense question. Like I need reasons to do things. And you don't learn any different unless you're governed by somebody else. Unless, like, first you get this training wheels version of, like, learn to follow rules. And eventually you'll learn to be able to follow your own rule. They are, aren't they? People say that they're so pure and, like, angelic. Like, no. No, they're awful. If adults acted the way small children did, we'd, like, not hesitate one moment to call them assholes. Moral liberty. Here's what Rousseau has to say about the gaining of moral liberty through civil society. He says, the passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a very remarkable change in man, in humans. The role that instinct used to play in her conduct is now taken over by a sense of justice, and her actions now have a moral aspect that they formerly lacked. Formerly lacked. The voice of duty has taken over from physical impulses, and a sense of what is right has taken over from mere appetite. And now, only now, this person has until now only considered themselves... Sorry, I lost track of that. Does that ever happen to you guys when you're reading? It's like, where'd the sentence go? And now, only now, the person who has until now considered only herself finds herself forced to act on different principles and to consult her reason before listening to her inclinations. Rousseau goes on. In this civil state, she is deprived of many advantages that she got from nature, but she gets enormous benefits in return. Her faculties are so stimulated and developed, her ideas are extended, her feelings are ennobled, and her whole soul uplifted. All of this happens to such an extent that if the abuses of this new condition didn't often pull her down to something lower than she was in the state of nature, she would be bound to bless continually happy the moment that took her from it forever, and out of a dull, limited animal, made into a thinking being, a human. Civil society, living in the civil state, this movement, this progress of going from natural liberty to civil and moral liberty, this is what makes us human. Civil society, it domesticates us. It makes us human. We're not really human before this. Not in any kind of like morally interesting way. We're not really significantly different than a mere beast. It's in this movement from natural liberty to civil liberty. It's in this movement from the state of nature into civil society that we actually become human. It's a domestication, as maybe that's not civilization, right? Civil society civilizes us. We like this idea? Does it sound about right? Pearson.
In psychology, I can't remember what it is, but I think it's like these levels. It's like Maslow or something. Does somebody know what I'm talking about?
Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
It's the hierarchy of needs. And isn't it like to where the rudimentary things are like need food and shelter?
Need food, water, shelter, yeah.
And then ultimately it gets to things like, I don't know what's the top, it sounds something like this.
The thing at the self-actualization, right? It's the ability to like make plans for yourself and pursue those plans. And this is different than just doing whatever you feel like, right? It's this ability to set goals. This is to rule yourself is to make rules and follow those rules for yourself. And we might think to ourselves like, yeah, but that's not what happens in civil society. I don't get to do it for myself. Others do it for me. I'm subject to those rules. And the trick to this, Rousseau is going to say, is like, you're not just subject, you're citizen as well. You're both citizen and subject. And this is what it means to rule yourself. And this is why the liberty that you gain in civil society is clearly greater than whatever liberty you might lose in leaving the state of nature. Buying it? Have we satisfied this Randian objection over here? All right. I'm not sure if I am, but like, yeah, it sounds pretty. Sounds really cool. It makes me kind of like stiffen my posture a little bit. I'm like, that's right. I'm a human. lives in society. It's better than like a mere beast. Better than a mere beast, I don't know. But like certainly I'd prefer to live like that, right? Despite the fact that like sometimes I look at my dog or I look at my cats, especially when I have a lot of grading to do or like I need to like come teach a class and I'm not super psyched about teaching, I think to myself like maybe it would be better to just kind of lay around and let somebody else like bring me my kibble and I'd like be able to lick my own butt and like all of those things. Like this would be much nicer. I wouldn't care about all the things that I care about. Wouldn't it be blessed to live as a cat instead of a human? I don't know.
Yes.
Yes? Sarah says yes? There's nothing stopping you. I bet you can find a wealthy person that will keep you as a pet. What's that? Yes, you should be, right? Perhaps you should be. There's a certain indignity in that. At least insofar as, like, what was that? A sugar daddy, right, yeah. Yeah. This is even, like, I think a little bit more perverse than a sugar daddy, right? This is enslaving yourself to somebody, right? This is like denying your will.
Yeah.
It's a benevolent form of slavery. It's not like they're not going to make you go pick cotton or anything. They're just going to make you give unconditional love and look pretty, but you don't get to make any decisions for yourself. That's like the tricky part, right? I mentioned that the social contract that brings us into civil society, that brings us into this civil state, that kind of forms the general will and kind of crystallizes it. That this is a deal that we make with ourselves. Rousseau says we make a commitment in this social contract to ourselves and to everybody else, such that as members of the state, which is to say as subjects, we make a commitment to the sovereign. And as sovereigns, which is to say as citizens, right, we make a commitment to every individual in the state, including ourselves. And this is the only way to make this work, is to like commit ourselves to every individual in the state and ourselves. Remember, they're not any different. They are the same thing. My commitment to every member of the civil society, to all of the parts of the body politic, is this way that I honor myself, that I make a commitment to myself. Because I am one of these parts as well. And sovereignty, this is just like the active dimension of the general will. Sovereignty is really nothing more than, it's the exercise of the general will. It's taking that general will and it's putting it into action. If there's power or authority behind that sovereignty, it's the legitimacy that comes from the fact that the general will represents everybody's will. It represents the good of all, the common good, the commonwealth, right? Let's toss that one into the mix here. The commonwealth. Now with a hyphen, so we recognize that yes, the commonwealth, the state, is the common good. They are like one and the same thing. A little more than halfway through the class, a little more than halfway through the board. All right. This sovereign, or sovereignty as Rousseau is discussing it, is inalienable. That's interesting, I suppose. So we were just saying, I've seen this word alienation with Rousseau before. Alienation was what I had to do with my individual will in order for there to be a general will, in order for there to be a civil society, in order for me to move from the state of nature into the civil state. But sovereignty is inalienable. How does this work? Hobbes, this is completely against what Hobbes says, right? The sovereignty is exactly alienable for Hobbes. I give up whatever sort of natural individual sovereignty I might have to the sovereign, and this is what grants them authority. That I can give authority to somebody else. This is what Hobbes says the Leviathan is, right? It's all of our authority is alienated from ourselves and invested in one figure, in one artificial person. But Rousseau says, no. Sovereignty is inalienable. You can't do it. You can't give over your authority. You're right?
So sorry, there's just this bug that won't leave me alone.
Kill it.
No, it'll start smelling bad.
Oh.
It's not open side.
You can feel free to move someplace else too, by the way. Yeah. How exciting. Is there anybody who's like, I'll be fine in the state of nature? Like a little bit of nature comes into the classroom and you're like, ah! That's true. Yeah, that's a very scary. Bugs are very scary things. They can kill us. They don't listen to reason, right? You're like, bug, go back outside. It's better for you. And the bug's like, I don't care. So what was I talking about? Yeah, sovereignty is inalienable. You can't actually give your sovereignty over to somebody else, which is maybe a little bit surprising because it almost sounded like that's exactly what Rousseau was talking about when he says we alienate our individual will to the community. And maybe it's easy to think this way because it seems like this is pretty much what Hobbes was saying. So this is inalienable, contra Hobbes. So what does this mean? How can I make sense of this? That sovereignty is inalienable. I can't give authority away to anybody. Then how is there a sovereign? How is there any kind of authority through which the Commonwealth can exercise the general will? How do we force people to be free if sovereignty isn't inalienable? Again, not a rhetorical question. Shall I ask it again? So, but at least I'm seeing good faces now, genuine puzzlement, thinking is happening, not this kind of blank cow stare. Not all the time, but sometimes. Yeah, I ask a question, everyone's like. How does this work? One way that it works, maybe the way that it works. I'll help you out on this one. Next one, though, is on you, for sure. One way that it works is there must be an active voice, an active sort of participation of each member of the society. You don't get to be a citizen exercising sovereign authority. You have to be a citizen exercising sovereign authority. There must at the very least be access. We might even go so far as to say that what's being suggested here is mandatory participation in government. You don't get to be a free rider. You have to help enforce the rules. You have to help make the rules? We'll get to that with the law and the lawgiver. But everybody has to be an active participant in the society. You don't get to do it whenever you feel like. Just like you don't get to only follow the rules whenever you feel like. You don't only have to be subject to the law whenever you feel like it. You have to follow the law whenever it applies to you, right? And you have to enforce the law whenever the opportunity presents itself to you. Maybe this is mandatory voting. Maybe this is mandatory participation in some sort of fashion in the civil state. Maybe you can't set up a sort of thing like Hobbes is talking about, where everybody just kind of agrees to let somebody else take care of the all of the civil goings on, and the rest of us just kind of sit back and follow the rules. Rousseau's saying no way. You can't actually have a fully functioning civil state that way. You can't have a general will that is actually being exercised unless every single member of the community is actively participating in the state. MK.
Don't we kind of passively do that, how people are required to go to court sometimes?
Yeah, jury duty. Yeah, jury duty might be an excellent sort of example of this. When you're called up, you've got to go. This isn't to say that you have to be a bureaucratic administrator every moment of every day, because you got to sleep and you got to make sandwiches and you got to do your job. There's lots of stuff in everybody's life that has nothing to do with the general will and the commonwealth. There are like all kinds of spaces available to each individual where they can kind of do whatever. Like nobody cares. Well, maybe this is not true, but like let's go ahead and say, like for the sake of argument, it is not anybody else's business, and it doesn't have any effect on anybody what television programs you watch when you go home. You can do whatever you want then, right? But insofar as you're participating in these, is this true? Or is it like, no, you have a moral responsibility, a civic responsibility to watch the right kinds of television programs? Amanda, you had your hand up?
Yeah. Could it be as simple as just following the laws, or does it have to be something more active?
Just following the laws is that's the passive capacity of like that's being a subject, not a citizen. Yeah. The activity side of it is acting as sovereign.
So he's saying you have to be a citizen.
Yeah, and it might actually be the sort of thing that like doesn't require a whole lot of effort. It could just be like every so often everybody checks in with you and you're like, are you okay with how everything's going? And you're like, thumbs up, I like it. You're like, okay, you officially grant your approval each time. And maybe we can even talk about ways in which this consent is tacit, just in your participation in the everyday goings-on. But it seems like Rousseau is giving like a much more active, and not just saying like it's allowable for you to be an active component of the sovereign. He's saying it has to be the case, because you can't alienate that authority to some other figure. You have to keep it for yourself. It only gets exercised when every single member is exercising it. Thomas, you seem like you want to say something. Nope. That's just the face you were wearing right then? Okay. All right, I said I was going to do this one for you and then make you do the next one. Sovereignty is inalienable. That's book 2, chapter 1. Yeah, book 2, chapter 1. Book 2, chapter 2. Sovereignty is Ian. It's indivisible. I said this one was contra Hobbes, that it's inalienable, because Hobbes seems to indicate that we all do alienate our own individual sovereignties and create the Leviathan, this artificial person that we imbue with all of our wills and authorities. Indivisible, perhaps contra Locke, who talks about division of powers within the state, or separation of powers, that there has to be this separation of powers. Sovereignty is indivisible in the sense that like the powers cannot be separated from one another. Now maybe there's some kind of just ordinary division of labor that goes on here, but it's not a division of authority. This is crucially important. There might be a division of labor, but there's no division of authority. And another way of looking at this idea that sovereignty is indivisible, as Rousseau goes on to explain, is that you can't have any factions. No factions. Factions are absolutely toxic to a civil society. There is no general will when you've divided the body politic up into like different parts and said like this part wants the destruction of this other part. Now you might have disagreements within the society where like two groups are saying like, well, we think that like we should have these laws, and other folks say like, no, we think we should have these other laws, and like maybe you'll get like a group of folks will begin to identify with like certain groups. Like I'm with the people who want these laws, and like I'm with the people who want these laws. This is not necessarily factions in the sense that Rousseau is talking about, because perhaps we can all still agree that like what the end is, what the goal of making the laws is to kind of bring us all together, move us from a state of nature into civil society, to execute the general will. But as soon as we start thinking in terms of like, those people are not just folks with different ideas, and we got to figure out whose ideas are the right ones, such that like we have common goals, but perhaps we just have completely different goals. Or when we start to think that the only way for us to succeed is for this other opposing faction to be destroyed, there just is no general will anymore. You can't have it. Everything falls apart. Ian, you had your hand up?
So would you say that like modern day political
Is it a manifestation of the factionalism that Rousseau was talking about?
I don't know if they would have to be that way, but boy, and I don't want to that's a good question. In fact, it's such a good question that it's the next reflection draft question. Which is given the state of politics in American society right now, and feel free, draw from Hobbes, draw from Locke, draw from Rousseau if you want to. Tell me if, are we living in a civil society? And is it even possible for us to be living in a civil society right now? Because we have some of the trappings. But according to, how Rousseau starts this whole project off, perhaps we were born free, but everywhere in chains. It's certainly possible for there to be political parties that aren't factions in this sense. They're just kind of loose conglomerations of ideas about how best to execute the general will. But if they're opposing interest groups, if that's what it is, if political parties are interest groups, if these factions are ways of kind of dividing up the interests of these people against the interests of this other faction, this can't be, right? Splitting the interests of the body politic destroys the body. There can't be a general will if there's the interests of these people versus the interests of these people. Everybody's interests have to be coordinated and in sync with one another. And if you think that this just isn't possible, then maybe the kind of civil society that Rousseau is talking about is something you're yes, that's a nice fairy tale, Rousseau, but it's just not possible. But we start to think about this way that civil society, when executed properly, civilizes us and makes us into the kinds of people that is it possible? Maybe we just need the right kinds of laws, right? And we don't have the right kinds of laws? If we had better laws, are there laws out there that everybody could get on board with, and we just have yet to find them? We'll get to that in just a moment. Book 2, Chapter 1, sovereignty is inalienable. Book 2, Chapter 2, sovereignty is indivisible. Book 2, Chapter 3, can the general will be wrong? I'm not even going to put it on the board because there's not a whole lot of space, and I don't think we need to write this on the board. Can the general will be wrong? No. No, the general will cannot be wrong. Now, this almost sounds like what Hobbes was saying, too, right? That the sovereign can't be wrong. And Rousseau is saying the general will is just the sovereign is just this kind of dimension of the body politic such that it's exercising the general will. And that can't ever be wrong. So whatever the government says, you just got to follow it if it's expressing the general will, right? If sovereign authority is legitimate, and the only way for it to be legitimate is for it to be the exercising of the general will, then it can't be wrong. But the way that Hobbes said it, it's kind of whatever the king says, that's what's right. Because there is no injustice outside of the king's say-so. And what Rousseau is saying here is that, as soon as the expression of the general will becomes wrong, if the general will were to be wrong, it just wouldn't be the general will. The whole point of the general will is that it's the thing that satisfies everybody's interests. What was that, Benjamin?
The common good.
It's the common good, the commonwealth, right? Always by definition right. As soon as it was something different, it just wouldn't be the general will anymore. Which raises an interesting question. How do we figure out what the general will is? We take a vote? Is the product of a democratic election the general will?
Not really. Unless it's unanimous.
A unanimous product of a democratic election. Is that the general will? Yes? Necessarily?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily? This was a quiz question, wasn't it? Yeah. Josh? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
But I would still say that, the majority would be general.
The majority would be the general will? This is how we decide what the general will is we vote, and whatever the majority says, that's the general will.
But it's not the other.
Not the other what? So is the majority always right? Because the general will, can the general will be wrong? No. Can a majority in a society be wrong? Can a unanimous decision by a democratic body politic, can that possibly be wrong?
Yeah.
Can it be inconsistent with the common good? Yeah, it totally can. Rousseau explains how people can be tricked into voting against their interests. And especially with factions, we can say I'm aligning my interests with this faction because I think that they're going to serve my interests best, but I might have to sacrifice some of my interests in order to get my faction to survive. Now I'm splitting interests not just within the body politic, I'm splitting interests within myself as well. That I have some interests that are not going to be satisfied in order to satisfy other interests. A democratic majority, even a unanimous one, is not the general will. It might be the best chance we have at trying to approximate the general will. But we shouldn't confuse the two. We shouldn't grant absolute sovereignty to a democratic majority, even a unanimous one. Let alone a supermajority, right? That's sovereignty. No, sovereignty is something that comes from the exercise, the authentic, legitimate exercise of the real general will, which is the thing that kind of coordinates and unifies everybody's interests and satisfies them. As soon as anybody stops doing that, sovereign authority is just not legit. Now, the bar is so high, right? Could this ever happen? Jack?
So the general will are we assuming it can only be basal things that no one in their right mind would disagree with, keep food coming in and don't set the whole country on fire?
Those are certainly part of it, yeah. There are other things that might be the sorts of things that various representatives of the state might exercise as, Rousseau calls them decrees. They're not really quite laws. They don't come with any kind of sovereign authority. They're just everybody agreeing to do something. It's not necessarily for the common good, but maybe it's for the common good that we make some sort of agreement. We all decide to drive on the right side of the road instead of just letting it be pick a side of the road. Everybody do their own thing, right? I don't know that the right side of the road satisfies the common good any better than driving on the left side of the road does, but picking something seems to be necessary, right? Naming streets. We can't just let anybody name the streets. But it doesn't seem like it really aims at the common good. The real law, oh yeah, Amanda?
So is Rousseau saying that the people don't know what the general will, what the best general will is? Because if everybody was voting on it,
There's no the best general will. The general will is that's the good. It's the good for everybody. Yeah. So there aren't better and worse general wills.
So is he saying that people don't know it because if people were voting on it, they'd be able to determine it?
They don't just naturally know it. They have to become civilized in order to know it. They have to become the sorts of people who are capable of recognizing good laws. Yeah, a little frustrated? Do you think, is there some circularity here? Rousseau said, it all hangs together, but I can't say it all at once. And are we starting to suspect that, maybe there's some circularity here? How is it that you become civilized? How is it that you become capable of recognizing what the general will is? And he says, you live under the general will. You become civilized by living in the civil state. Well, but how do we get a civil state? We have to have the sorts of laws that kind of organize society according to the, who's, yeah. It's my belt loops are holding up my belt, but my belt is holding up my pants and the belt loops. Who's the real hero down there, right? There's who's doing the work? And we can get some sense of this in this kind of relationship between the law and the lawgiver. There are plenty of interesting things to say about the lawgiver. Probably most notably about the lawgiver is that Rousseau seems to suggest that it's probably not going to be somebody from the community. A lawgiver probably has to be some sort of like, first of all, he says like we would have to have like a god to be the lawgiver. But short of that, maybe just an incredibly wise foreigner who comes and doesn't make the laws. This is why, like, the chapter in which this is discussed, and Rousseau does this from time to time. It's very, very frustrating. I don't know if you encountered this. He talks about the social contract. That's the title of the piece, the social contract. But almost every time he mentions it throughout the social contract, he calls it the social compact instead of contract. Like, what's the difference? There's a chapter in which he discusses the lawmaker and then proceeds to call him the lawgiver every time. And stresses that the lawgiver only proposes laws. They can only make suggestions. That there's supposed to be somebody who's like a little bit wiser and presumably like has no dog in the fight as to what the laws are going to be. There are kind of like anticipations of like eventually things that John Rawls is going to like pull out of Rousseau here. We might even think about like this kind of original position or veil of ignorance sort of thing. Like in order to be the sort of person who could make real laws that are going to satisfy the general will, or can even design real laws, you have to not have any self-interest in what kinds of laws are going to be made, right? You have to be able to like do this from a kind of a disinterested position. Maybe not a disinterested position, but one where like you don't know exactly which position you might end up occupying in the society. Am I going to be a rich person? Am I going to be a poor person? I have to not know in order to design laws that are going to be actually fair, that are actually going to satisfy the general will. But all of the interesting things about the lawgiver, actually no, like not aside. First, just one more thing about the lawgiver. Rousseau is perhaps even like thinking about himself in this respect. You guys like, was there some mention of this in the footnotes? Rousseau actually designed constitutions for like two different groups of people, for Corsica and for Poland. Neither one ended up working out. Corsica got conquered and annexed by France, and Poland ended up kind of splitting into like they couldn't maintain themselves as a people. They like the body politic just exploded through like no small part due to like meddling from Russia, who didn't want this kind of like unified Poland threatening any of their interests. Happens from time to time. It's like it's geopolitics all over the place, right? Yeah. But he did. He designed constitutions for people, thinking of himself of like this wise foreign lawgiver that's going to come in and say like, here's how you guys should do things. The United States did this as well. We like brought in folks from other countries to help us design our Constitution. It was like mostly done by founding father, like potential American citizens. But like when Rousseau talks about this, it's an interesting sort of like figure that he's talking about. And the most notable thing about it is that like the lawgiver, this person who designs and proposes the laws, can't actually be a member of the body politic. Perhaps this is because there is no body politic yet, but also because they have to kind of have no interest in exactly how this pans out. Corinne? Good question. General laws versus specific laws. Sovereign authority. Are there any limits to it? This doesn't seem like it's answering your question, but I'm on my way to it. Are there any limits to sovereign authority? In one breath, Rousseau says sovereign authority is absolute. But we have an old familiar sort of move that we've seen almost every social contract theorist make here. It's absolute asterisk, with the big limitation being that sovereign authority, which is nothing more than the exercise of the general will, P.S., must apply generally. This is because the general will can only prescribe laws to itself. For I was saying that like when I make the social contract, when I make the social compact, I make it with myself. The general will also only applies to itself. It only applies generally. So Rousseau ends up saying, as far as the law is concerned, when we talk about laws, like legitimate laws that are like the exercise of the general will, it can only apply to all. Laws must apply to all. Not to each, although maybe to each, but specifically to all, generally. There can only be general laws. This is the whole point of a fair and just law, is that it has to apply equally to every member of the society. There cannot be laws that are only making prescriptions to particular parts of the society. They have to always be laws that apply to everything, to everyone. Yes?
I feel like with that, he's kind of missing the point of certain laws because some laws are made in order to protect people from something that has happened. And so laws, like you have to add to the laws whenever a catastrophe happens.
So
In that case, you can have somebody foreign.
So are we thinking about like maybe laws that are like specifically aimed towards suspect classes or something like that?
I'm not sure specifically. I'm thinking more about like there was like a fire or something like that, like a fire escape for people to get out, or I don't really have an example.
See if you can come up with one. We might think of like one example that comes to mind, mostly because it was in my notes and I used it last semester that I taught this. What if I have a law that says if you're a convicted felon, you can't vote? Isn't that a law that only applies to like part of the society? Yeah? But it affects everyone, says Shai. Rachel? Yeah, this applies for any of us. If you become a convicted felon, you will not be allowed to vote. This is like the clever move there, right? But I can't, for example, make a law that says, can I make a law that says if you're mentally ill, if you're diagnosably mentally ill, you are not allowed to purchase a firearm? That was the other possible reflection draft was going to be about like self-defense rights and Second Amendment rights. I decided to go with this other one instead.
It would apply to everyone because you can't feasibly make yourself mentally insane, but it applies to everyone because you can shoot anyone you want, technically. Anyone you're capable of, especially if you're mentally ill, you might want to.
That's not most mentally ill folks, by the way. Most mentally ill folks are quite gentle and not dangerous at all. There are definitely, this is a really interesting passage where like Rousseau is talking about how like, it kind of helps close this loop when he says like it all hangs together and we're like, okay, so like I only make, the whole point of moral liberty is the ability to rule myself. The whole point of participation in civil society is that like I get to rule myself. Like, but you're subject to the laws of the sovereign. You're like, but I am the sovereign. Not all by myself. Each of us is in part the sovereign, and each of us is in part the subjects that have to obey the sovereign. The general will only applies to itself. It only applies to the totality of the society. But now we're wondering, like, yeah, so how do the details play out on that? What would it mean to have a law that only applies to specific parts of the body politic, but not to the entire body politic? Yeah. In the discussion of the laws, Rousseau seems to suggest that like you cannot have a functioning civil state without proper laws. And those laws can only come from a almost like godly wise foreigner, which is like, wow, the bar is really, really high. But then he adds on top of this that even if we had totally awesome laws, we still might not get a functioning civil society because you have to have a people that is well suited to receiving those laws. And he gives all kinds of conditions that need to be satisfied for this. There are temporal conditions. The people can't have been together for too long. They can't have been together for too short of a period of time. There has to be the right number of people. Rousseau says every member of the society has to know every other member of the society. Anybody know like how big could that possibly be? Like the latest info from social psychologists says like in the neighborhood of 200 people. This is why I can't remember all of my students' names because there's more than 200 of them each semester. I know all of you guys, but not other classes. There are all kinds of idiosyncratic concerns that go into this that say like every single like set of laws and every single like question of like how a people comes together is going to depend on like local conditions. If it's a seafaring community, they're going to have slightly different conditions. If they're like a plains community, slightly different conditions again. But the laws have to match the people, and the people have to be the sorts of things that can receive the laws. This is hard. This is really, really hard, such that like we might have some inkling of what Rousseau's answer to this upcoming reflection draft might be. But maybe Rousseau's setting the bar too high. Maybe? Maybe not? That's it for Rousseau. Our next reading is going to be our good friend Immanuel Kant.